Greece more bankrupt than ever, says Varoufakis. Sign up for latest news plus tips to save money and the environment. Subscribe. When you subscribe, we will use the information you provide to send you these. Sometimes they'll include recommendations for other related newsletters or services. Our privacy notice explains more about how we use your data and your rights. You can unsubscribe at any. Critics of Brussels following the EU coronavirus crisis have cited the event as an example of why Britain is better out. It came as the outfit was too slow to pass through legislation that would enable the mass rolling out of its vaccine program. Many countries have as a result been left without the jabs that should mark the beginning of the end of the pandemic. This was while the soared ahead, having administered almost 13 million people with their first jab of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. The pharmaceutical company has production facilities in Belgium and the Netherlands, with millions of doses leaving the continent for Britain, much to the dismay of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. After briefly threatening the EU's vaccine supplies and triggering Article 16 of the Brexit deal, effectively erecting a hard border on the island of Ireland, Ms von der Leyen backtracked and reversed the decision. Many noted it was too late, however, with polls now showing how even ardent Remainers were disappointed with the EU's actions, and the World Health Organization's Director General, Tedros Adhanom, warned the bloc against vaccine nationalism. The bureaucratic nature of the EU means that its mass vaccination program is still far behind where Robert Toombs, the renowned British historian, told Express.co.uk that they initially joined what was then the European Economic Community, EEC, in order to keep up with the post-World War II consensus, not expecting to find a Brussels parliament that was a facade essentially governed by a civil service. He went as far to argue that Britain rushed into Europe, a move that was too hasty and almost inevitably fermented an unstable future relationship between. Professor Toombs said, "People don't ask if they rushed into Europe often, and I think they did rush." Trending, you could say Britain was hanging around for several years after the European coal and steel community was created. But nevertheless, there was a desire to get into the EEC later on, which retrospectively seems we weren't under such pressure as people of the time thought. If we'd been willing to take our time over it, and maybe sign a deal with the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, which we were a founder member, then we'd probably have had a better and more stable relationship with the EEC. Many politicians and civil servants at the time felt under pressure because they thought Britain was in decline and that this was going to. In hindsight, it clearly wasn't. The Treaty of Accession was signed in January 1972 by Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath. He officially became a member of the EEC on January 1, 1973. It would leave the single market and customs union exactly 7 years. In Professor Toombs' book, This Sovereign Isle, he presents Mr. Heath's decision as a strange. Britain's empire had recently disbanded, and an effort to create a commonwealth that would be a third arm of the country's foreign policy was However, Professor Toombs writes that this was no reason for them to sign up to the. He said, having an empire had not been the source of Britain's power or wealth. Compared with its old rivals France and Germany, Britain has more than held its own, both militarily and the historian goes on to note the inflated sense of worry that found itself at the heart. He references a Whitehall warning from the time, that exaggerated the future power of the EEC, which told the government, the community may well emerge as a power comparable in size and influence to the United States and the USSR, whereas our diminished status would suggest only a minor role for us in international affairs. All of which, Professor Toombs argues, was not true. Even former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was one of the more enthusiastic conservative politicians on the subject of Europe, later in her career saw the problems with a growing European superstate. Elsewhere, experts have suggested that the EU might one day implode as a result of its own. Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's former finance minister, in a 2015 TED Talk explained how the two spheres of the world, the political and economic, have distorted many institutions like the EU and its euro. He said the economic sphere had colonized the political sphere and so left European politicians. Mr. Varoufakis argued that this will ultimately cause more crises in the future, like the one witnessed in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, for those tied to the EU. He said, "Have you wondered why politicians are not what they used to be? It's not because their DNA has degenerated. It is rather because one can be in government today and not in power, because power has migrated from the political to the economic sphere." He has noted that they might well escape from the potential future catastrophes that hit the bloc now that it has